Hello, welcome to my channel, and thank you for being here. Today I'm going to speak about a series of images um, which can be considered an essay, but were really part of an exhibition, which I'll talk a bit more about shortly. But I'm going to begin with the first one, which isn't actually part of that essay. And the caption, and the image you see now, the caption simply reads Brixton, Johannesburg, 1991. And this image, in a sense, contextualizes um, the rest of the images that you'll see that don't really have a relation to this but are contextualized. And I hope that will make sense as I speak through the rest of the images. I lived in Brixton um, round about this period, 1989, 1990. I can't remember the exact year, but I spent about a year living in Brixton. And when I arrived in Brixton, it was really the only time I experienced overt racism in my entire life, actually, as a black man, colored, mixed race, hybridized person living in this country. And I sometimes think that perhaps, it was because I was a fair-skinned mixed race person that I didn't elicit the sometimes overt racism that most black people experienced overtly. But I had moved in with a white lover at the time to um, a, a house in Brixton, and experienced from white people across the road, name calling and aggressive behavior. I was young enough to not really take it seriously. Um, but I think this image shows the kind of sentiment that existed at the time in South Africa, and certainly in places like Brixton, which were like kind of working class suburb close to the city. Um, um, I also think it needs to be said that this was also at a time that there was an ascendancy of a right-wing conservative Afrikaans political party called the Afrikaner Weerstanding Beweging, or commonly known as the AWB, founded by Eugene Ter Blanche, a noted racist. And this political party, for most of us, had overtly uh, Nazi connotations. Was fascist in its orientation, and and had the symbolism of its iconography that is similar to the kind of symbolism you see in my opinion, in countries like Ukraine, where and other parts of Europe, where there's the resurgence of this Nazi sentiments. Um, I, I think I think maybe I should just mention at this time that the only time the first time rather that I, other than this incident in Brixton, that I experienced racism was actually in London, when I arrived there as a 24-year-old, and I had two quite inebriated biddies bump into me in the street and then and crudely tell me, um, you know, um, calling me the N word to get out of their way. I actually broke out in laughter. I was just so I couldn't take it seriously at all. I was so astonished. I mean, they were so clearly so trivial in their drunken, inebriated state that I really couldn't take it seriously. But of course, I mean, I might not have experienced racism uh, or had it articulated verbally to me, but I certainly experienced it in my life in terms of, where I was forced to live, the kind of my educational opportunities, the lack of business opportunities that my father experienced, the lack of job opportunities that I experienced as a young black South African growing up, and being 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 subjected to job reservation and racial discrimination in terms of where I could live and who I could have relationships with. So we'll now move on to quickly to work through, well, this will probably be a much longer talk, the rest of the images that I'm going to show, which were produced for an exhibition that showed in Lille, in France, the city of Lille in France. It was produced, which was an exhibition on African cities. And I was invited to participate and with other African photographers, and I photographed the city of Johannesburg for some months. So, I mean, this should have been a much longer project in terms of, I did try to continue it, but not very successfully. But anyway, the first image, the caption reads, "Inner City Shack Dweller, Joburg Park, Johannesburg, 2000." And this is the image that graces it's the introductory image to my website. I'm really rather fond of this image. I mean, I don't know what I suppose there's a lot to be said about it. This was a shack settlement that actually existed in the Joburg Park area, close to the current, almost adjoining the current taxi rank, between the Johannesburg Art Gallery and the taxi rank. There was an actual, it doesn't exist any longer, it was removed, but there was an actual shack settlement in that area. And this was an image that kind of captures the fragility and the absurdity of shackland life in as dire and as serious as it is. So yeah, it's an image that I suppose evokes more emotion than like a coherent response, because shacklands, yeah, there's what is coherent about them. The second image, the caption reads, "Former site of Khotsa House, home of the South African Council of Churches, bombed by state agents in 1989. Joburg Park, Johannesburg, 2000. Joburg Park features. This building, this was the remnant, what was built over a destroyed building after it had been bombed by the state, this apartheid state, as the caption says, the home of the South African Council of Churches. And Afripix used to have its offices in what was, I think, about 8, I'm not certain about the size of it. It was 8 or 9, 10, maybe 10-story building that occupied this space that you see here. So just like a one-floor building was built in its wake, in the space in which it had been. And so that I had spent years in that, and Afripix had spent years in that building of the South African Council of Churches. We'd been raided by the security polices there, and were part of the burgeoning movement of resistance to apartheid. So that image sort of is my response to that much later, and of course produced for this exhibition. The next image simply reads Johannesburg 2000, and this image was taken across from the High Court in Johannesburg, and from a Brazilian coffee shop, which the only probably reason probably reason it existed there at that time was, to serve the legal fraternity that spent a great deal of their time and had chambers in this high court across the road. So this rather charming image of a parent and child crossing the road from what used to be a favorite haunt of mine at the time, the Brazilian coffee shop, and a glimpse of Johannesburg in the background. The next image, the caption reads, Children's Community Art Project, Braamfontein, Johannesburg 2000. And yeah, I mean, I just loved the contrast between obviously, obvious contrast, of course, but I still think it made for quite a valid and strong image, of that. In the background, I think that's the Transnet building, and you know, not that I know a lot about architecture, but I wouldn't even know what you call this kind of this style of architecture, but it it reflects that kind of what I saw, in a kind of I suppose a Nazi Germany, that kind of brutal authority and regimentation, and being disrupted by these young kids with this somewhat anarchic creation taking place. And this was, of course, this was a whole lot of different kids were coming and adding to this. So it wasn't just done by these kids. Kids would come and a whole series of them, which was great actually, because it created that kind of anarchic tension. The next image reads, Indigent Inner City Dweller, Johannesburg 2000. And this is in the Park Station railway station, the Central Railway Station. And this guy was heading down in the evening, probably to spend the night on the railway, on the next to the railway tracks, but in the railway station. It reminded me of what I used to do when I backpacked through Europe. I spent a lot of time in railway stations, sleeping like that, sleeping rough, because I simply didn't have the money to always stay in backpackers or wherever. And in fact, in Milan, in Italy, I was robbed of everything, and spent a very interesting week trying to get my life back together again. Somewhat like the next image that reads, an indigent person in the inner city. This, when I produced it, Joburg Park again, Johannesburg 2000, and this is in the actual park, and it caught my eye that he was reading from a magazine that had this cartoon called Tuned In, and it kind of resonated for a lot of of us at the time in that rat race of the city. That in fact here was somebody that was pretty much tuned in to, like, how Africans should live their lives, actually. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be industrious, but before the West came here, people, something to think about. We're not starving, and we're not. I mean, I've just read recently. I'm reading something about on the Bushmen, that they had lots of time for leisure. Hunter-gatherer types, and so did pastoralists. Much more time for leisure, and that's something in the industrial world that we need to embrace. That leisure is a thing, actually. So, in the theme of leisure, the next image, Park in the Inner City, Johannesburg 2001. And yes, time for this kind of leisure in a post-industrial world would be welcome. And the final image simply reads Johannesburg 2000. And not very visible, but that phallic-shaped object in the background is Ponte, the notorious and once celebrated Ponte city. This is taken from the Berea, and a sign of the times of what was to befall Johannesburg, in a sense. And this brings us to the conclusion of my trawl through call and response. And in my next session, I will read an introduction, which is quite typical of me to introduce, work back to front, introduce at the end of the entire series. So I'll say thank you for watching, and more information on myself and my work can be found on my website, a link to which, including my blog and email address, can be found in the video description below. If you like this talk, remember to click the like button and press subscribe. It helps the channel grow.